Good morning and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 5th, 2021. And today in history on March 5th, 1770, was the Boston Massacre. And for many years, and most people don't really even know this, it was actually commemorated as kind of a solemn public holiday in Boston with speeches from prominent patriots. So on this episode, I'm going to do a very, very brief backgrounder on the massacre itself, and then I'm going to go through some of the highlights of John Hancock's 1774 Massacre Day speech. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, all spelled out. You're going to find all the archives, and on individual episodes, I include a bunch of links and references so you can read what I'm referencing and learn more on your own time and in full context. I also have all the different platforms, live streaming, archive video, plus audio-only podcast edition. And you can even find our membership program where you can support us financially for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And look, I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't say thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. I want to start out with a great blog from Dave Benner, who does so much great historical research and reporting and blogging for the site here. And this is one that we published, of course, on March 5th, but back in 2019. He says, "Today in history, on March 5th, 1770, a violent incident unfolded on Boston's King Street, where an agitated group of colonists swarmed around a group of British regulars. After a group of Bostonians uttered insults," Dave writes, "they threw snowballs and dared the British to fire. Several soldiers ultimately fired into the crowd." Going further, Dave says 5 Bostonians died and 6 were seriously wounded, including a young boy. This incident did much to exacerbate tensions between the colonists and the crown. We know that those tensions were already there, bubbling under the surface for quite a long time. You can go back to the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, and of course, the Townshend Acts, the New York Restraining Act, and the like. The quartering of the troops was a serious problem. And firebrands, Dave writes, such as Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, quickly branded the incident the Boston Massacre and worked quickly to depict the event as an egregious assault against a peaceable people. Additionally, they used the episode to initiate a boycott of British goods, which the two rallied support for over the coming months. In the court of public opinion, public unrest toward the British grew to an all-time high. Now, there are some legitimate historical questions about the culpability of people on that specific day. And Dave actually spends a little time very briefly covering those in his blog, which of course I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But interestingly enough, if we go deeper beyond what happened on that very day, and Hancock talked about this in his speech of 74, I think who's culpable is really pretty straightforward. But Dave sums it up like this. He says, "The event was a pivotal step on the road to independence." Now, it was so important to the people of Boston, maybe more so than anywhere else, that they actually commemorated it as a public holiday. Here from the Massachusetts Historical Society, let me pull this up on the screen. They say, "In the years immediately following the Boston Massacre, local residents began to commemorate the incident annually on or near the date of March 5th. These tributes appeared as special orations, poetry, and visual representations." Here from Wikipedia, we have an actual link to something called Massacre Day. That's what it was known as. It was actually a holiday in Boston from 1771 to 1783. It's not a holiday like we think of today, like celebrating. I mean, there was probably some of that from my understanding, but it was very solemn as well. It was a very serious situation. And so there was a different keynote speaker every single year. And they write this: James Lovell, I believe it's pronounced, delivered the first speech in 1771. The great Dr. Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren delivered the Massacre Day Oration in 72 and 75. Benjamin Church was the featured speaker in 1773, followed the next year by John Hancock, who I'm going to cover a little bit in just a moment. In emotional language, it reports the early speeches reminded listeners of the killings of civilians in Boston by British soldiers, while touching upon themes such as the dangers of standing armies in times of peace. This was a very consistent thing, and we're going to hear about that from Hancock as well, and oppositions to the policies of the British Parliament that the speakers believed violated colonial or natural rights. You get a whole list of these from revolution250.org of who did these orations over the years. And if you like this type of episode, I've got in my head that I should really do this every single year and commemorate a different speech, at least for the first 5, because those were pretty big ones. And here from Monticello.org, they say this: in 1774, and you can see these were printed out. This is a digital representation of that. It might actually be an actual scan, but they say in 1774, John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant, was chosen to deliver. That's such an understatement of who he was to the people of Boston at that time. But anyways, John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant, was chosen to deliver the 3rd annual oration to commemorate the Boston Massacre. Hancock warned his fellow colonists about British attacks on American liberties and urged them to stand firm in defense of their rights. Mind you, this was 1774, not 1787 or later on, so they were standing firm for real. The oration helped keep the cause of resistance alive in Massachusetts. And here are some highlights. And he starts out very humble, and he says this: the attentive gravity, the venerable appearance of this crowded audience, the dignity which I behold in the countenances of so many in this great assembly, the solemnity of the occasion upon which we have met together, joined to a consideration of the part I am to take in the important business of this day, fill me with an awe hitherto unknown, and heighten the sense which I have ever had of my unworthiness to fill this sacred desk. That's pretty awesome that he started out like that. He says, I have always from my earliest youth rejoiced in the felicity of my fellow men, and have ever considered it as the indispensable able duty of every member of society to promote, as far as in him lies, the prosperity of every individual. It wasn't just they had views of moral duty to support the liberty of the people. He said, but more especially of the community to which he belongs. They were localists. They weren't, they certainly were concerned with their neighbors, but their first goal was to advance the liberty and prosperity of the people in their own community. They weren't like being busybodies, wondering what everybody else was doing in every other part of the nation, of the other colonies, of the globe, like most people are today. Anyways, going a little bit further, here's what Hancock has to say, if I can get my mouse to work. He says, some boast of being friends to government. They actually would brag about that. I think they do that today as well. He says, I'm a friend to righteous government. So, some might say that's an oxymoron, but he said he's a friend to righteous government, to a government founded upon the principles of reason and justice. But I glory in publicly avowing my eternal enmity to tyranny. He was proud to take a strong stand against tyranny, not just behind the scenes, but publicly. And then he talks a little bit further. He says they have declared that they have ever had. This was one of the great problems of the British rule. This is what I've talked about many times on this show, that even there was a point in time where they recognized that they had to separate, even if the king started giving them concessions, even if Parliament started to back down, because they had this law on the books that claimed the power to bind them, quote, in all cases whatsoever. And John Hancock talked about this in 1774. He says, they have declared that they have ever had, and of right ought ever to have, full power to make laws of sufficient validity to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That's how he's really describing tyranny. And he's giving this example of taxation. We often think of, oh, taxation without representation. No, and Hancock was very clear. The taxation problem was really just an example of binding the people in all cases whatsoever. And he says they have exercised this pretended right by imposing a tax upon us without our consent. Going further, now we're thinking about culpability. Let's say the people of Boston taunted those soldiers, and you can just be sympathetic. Well, sooner or later, someone's going to fight back. But why the hell were they there in the first place? And that is the problem in and of itself. When you have an occupying force in a foreign land, really what you're talking about here, when people fight back, those people aren't the initiators of aggression. They're really the defenders of their homeland. And that's what John Hancock was getting at here in 1774. He says it was easy to foresee the consequences which so naturally followed upon sending troops into America to enforce obedience to acts of the British Parliament, which neither God nor man ever empowered them to make. So he knew, everyone should have known that if you send an army to another person's home, they are probably going to get into a conflict at some point. He says it was reasonable to expect that troops who knew the errand they were sent upon would treat the people whom they were to subjugate with a cruelty and haughtiness which too often buries the honorable character of a soldier in the disgraceful name of an unfeeling ruffian. And then he goes on to talk about how as soon as they got there, they're pointing cannons and like this is a show of force. And he says, our streets nightly resounded with the noise of riot and debauchery. Our peaceful citizens were hourly exposed to shameful insults. So it wasn't like, if you really want to think about who caused what, this is what he's saying. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. They were being kind of roughed up and bossed around. And sooner or later, people are going to be upset and they're going to push back. He says they were exposed to shameful insults and often felt the effects of their violence and outrage. But this was not all. As though they thought it not enough to violate our civil rights, they endeavored to deprive us of the enjoyment of our religious privileges, to vitiate our morals, and thereby render us deserving of destruction. Hancock was really a powerful speaker, I think. He says, but I forbear and come reluctantly to the transactions of that dismal night. He didn't really want to spend too much time on the pain and suffering, but he's talking more about principles. When in such quick succession we felt the extremes of grief, astonishment, and rage. He says, let all America join in one common prayer to heaven that the inhuman, unprovoked murders of the 5th of March 1770. So that's how he sees it. He sees it as unprovoked. He sees it as inhuman. He sees it as a murder because the standing army should never have been around in the first place. He goes on, he says, I'm not going to dwell too long upon the horrid effects which have already followed from quartering regular troops in this town. Let our misfortunes teach posterity to guard against such evils for the future. We should be learning from this today. And that was John Hancock's hope for the future. And he points out, of course, that standing armies were a huge problem. He says, since standing armies are so hurtful to a state, perhaps my countrymen may demand some substitute, some other means of rendering us secure against the incursions of a foreign enemy. And he goes to say, a well-disciplined militia is a safe and honorable guard to a community like this, whose inhabitants are by nature brave and are laudably tenacious of that freedom in which they were born. From a well-regulated militia, we have nothing to fear. Their interest is the same with that of the state. When a country is invaded, the militia are ready to appear in its defense. So again, talking about supporting of the natural right to keep and bear arms, of the people themselves to take up their own defense, and to reject the idea of a permanent standing army, especially in times of peace. And summing it up here, I really encourage you to read this whole thing. Some of it's kind of long, but I think it's really interesting. It's very powerful, especially in context. He says, surely you will never tamely suffer this country to be a den of thieves. Unfortunately, that's been lost. He says, remember, my friends, from whom you sprang. Despise the glare of wealth, that people who pay greater respect to a wealthy villain than to an honest, upright man in poverty almost deserve to be enslaved. They plainly show that wealth, however it may be acquired, is in their esteemed to be preferred to virtue. Man, to me, this just rings, it resonates. It almost gives me chills thinking about that. Mind you, this is the wealthy merchant, the wealthy guy saying, don't look to money. This isn't your leadership. We're looking to virtue. And who does he name? He's like, there's so many of these people. He names one person, and he names an Adams. And he's talking about Samuel Adams, of course, who was no rich man, but was considered a great moral, virtuous, the father of the American Revolution. He says, I named such an Adams, he says, when I name an Adams, such a numerous host of fellow patriots rush upon my mind that I fear it would take up too much of your time should I attempt to call over the illustrious roll. Again, focusing on virtue and a moral standing for justice and for liberty, not for just power and wealth and control. Opposing standing armies, supporting the right to keep and bear arms, and so many other things that should be our birthright today. Anyways, he goes on, he says, I have the most animating confidence that the present noble struggle for liberty will terminate gloriously for America. He sums it up with a prayer, and I hope you check this out on your own time. I will link to it in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed this commemoration of John Hancock's great 1774 Massacre Day oration. I expect, I've got it on my task list already for next year. I'll probably do one of Dr. Joseph Warren's. But if you like this show, you like this kind of episode, you like this kind of history, please let me know. And the way you can do that also helps us reach more people with this program. You can smash the like, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, share links, comment in the archive. All that stuff triggers the algorithm, and it tells the platform to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, do not feel obligated to do so. We're going to continue doing this kind of work no matter what. Over 10,000 articles and blogs and podcasts and stuff on our website, plus this show 3 days a week and more. We'll continue doing that for free, but you can help us reach and teach more people for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.